Welcome back. I'm excited to have you guys here to have this discussion with Ted Page, who is a co-founder and principal at Captains of Industry. Ted specializes in all forms of content marketing and branding, creating videos and storytelling, and is living in the greater Boston area. We get into talking a little bit of Red Sox, Yankees as a metaphor for people being able to get along. Now, I met Ted through researching different blogs and different websites about grandfathers, and he runs the Good Grandpa blog. So I've got links for that in the show notes, as well as we talk about it within the conversation that we're going to have. So you guys are in for a treat. Ted has got fascinating insights about being a grandfather and what being a grandfather really means in this day and age. You're going to hear us ask questions back and forth. As I was interviewing Ted, Ted was also asking questions about me and from me for his blog. So be sure to go to goodgrandpa.com and check out Ted's work there. And again, we'll put links in the show notes, and we'll go ahead and get ready for this conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Ted. Thank you so much for spending time with us on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I am so honored that we have you here and look forward to hearing about your experience and your stories.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm really honored and happy to join you and to meet my virtual digital grandpa doppelganger. Because when I heard about Cool Grandpa, I just had this realization that I'm not alone, and that was just a great feeling.
Yeah, it's really powerful when you do realize that other people are going through the same experiences that you are, even sometimes have the same ideas that you do. So sometimes we can definitely be sitting out here thinking we're the only ones, and it's great, like you said, when I found the Good Grandpa, that it was like, oh, here's somebody that had a very similar experience when they became a grandfather as I did.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of things I saw on your blog. I thought, wow, that really resonates with me. That really mirrors my experience. And it just made me realize just how many more grandpas and grandmas in their own way are going through similar experiences.
So as we start off with the conversation, what I love to do is ask grandfathers to take us back to when you first learned that you were going to be a grandfather. What was your reaction? Because it's all over the place. It's everywhere from I'm way too young to, oh boy, I thought this would never happen.
It was quite a shock to set the stage. My daughter, who is a very crafty and clever woman, invited me and our in-laws over for a Valentine's Day get-together. And so my daughter and son-in-law have been married about 3 years. And I didn't really think about it too much at the time. Why are they having us and the in-laws over for a Valentine's Day? It wasn't a Christmas, wasn't a New Year's. It was a Valentine's Day. Only in hindsight, and I could see something was up. So she hands out the Valentine's Day cards to us, my wife and I, and one to my wife and I and one to our in-laws. And one of my in-laws, the dad, he opens his envelope, and I'll never forget the look on his face, and then his head just kind of snapped back and his jaw dropped with this total look of total shock and surprise. So I saw it first on a different man's face, but one who was connected now through us, through this larger family. And then I opened the card, and there is a sonogram for a Valentine's card. So instantly I did the same thing. Like my head snaps back and I'm sharing with my wife. We're all crying, we're hugging, and, true to form, my daughter pulled off, the great reveal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just the absolute flood of emotions that I found particularly overwhelming. And I would say, there, along with the joy, there is that sense, certainly for me and others, the words, "Oh, I'm not ready for this," but simultaneously knowing, it's not about me. It's not about what I'm ready for. It's about what they're ready for, right? But that was just a real life moment that this happened, and it made perfect sense, right? It was just a few years after their wedding, but I was also about 55 years old, and I associated grandfatherhood with my grandfather, the one that I knew, the one who survived into old age. And he was well into his 70s and 80s at the time that I really bonded with him as a teenager. So grandfather was synonymous with someone who was at a different stage in their life than I was at 55.
You're right. I can totally relate with that because I had very much the same feeling. One, there was a little bit of I'm very happy for them. My kids had been married for a couple of years at that point. We certainly knew that, this is going to happen at some point. But then there's also a little bit of like, wait a second, you guys are making me old and I'm not old enough for this yet. And I was at the tender age of 49 when this happened. And, I'm still very much the same way. I'm thinking about my grandfather who was probably about my age when I came along, but my memories of him are when I was closer to, let's say, 12 years old, a teenager, when he was already in his late 60s and 70s. And so my mind was, it took me a little while to grapple with that, where it was like, wait a second, my grandfather was probably early 50s when I came along. And then, like we were talking about, it's, 12, 15 years down the road when you start to realize that, oh, he's 65 at this point. There's a lot more changes going on. And certainly they had different lifestyles and different experiences, which I don't know, to me seems like it made them older than maybe we are.
Do you think there was behavior that they exhibited, the grandfather that you knew, that you associated with a different generation?
I think some of it may have been physical ailments, maybe. My grandfather had a hitch in his step, eventually it led to a hip replacement. And then I think, too, there was a lot more of the gray hair and wrinkles. And some of that can definitely be attributed to life as a farmer. He was a wheat farmer out in eastern Oregon. So, what we know now, tons of sunshine, no sun protection, weather beaten. If you picture that old pioneer cowboy face, that's similar, right? So that's a little bit of the memories from the physical characteristics, plus coming through that depression in World War II and coming through that era, certainly whether it's physical or mental, emotionally, took a toll on everybody that went through that time period.
Hearing you talk about it, and just the start of this conversation of the timing of this just reminded me of a thought I had then, which is still kind of relevant to me today, which is, based on conversations I've had with other people who are, roughly my age, who have kids who are roughly, the age of my kids, but they don't have grandkids yet. And there's this sense of thinking, well, that's going to happen when it happens, right? So it's something that is, because it is so far out of our own control, that when it does happen, for me, it felt that much more, I don't know, magical, I guess. Like an incredible gift that I couldn't make happen. Like right. The only thing I made, if I did anything right, I helped make some great kids. I played my part. I was the best dad I could be, my personal best, I hope, right? You always, really try to, be partners with, our spouse and do the right thing for them. Aside from that, this just happened. And I just feel like this sense of gratitude for that. That's, there's just the fact that it was something outside my personal power.
Right. There's a little bit of that as we went through this experience, that we gave up that sense of control or surrendered to it, whatever the phrase is that we want to use to it, and not being able to control it. So there's a little bit of that, I don't know, the first time on a roller coaster where there's going to be ups and downs and twists and turns and things, but if you haven't ridden the ride before, those things can come as a surprise to you. And I like roller coasters, so it's a welcome surprise. You go with it and you don't fight it. And it's such a rewarding experience becoming that grandfather and knowing that, hey, there's going to be more required of you. You may have had a little bit of a pause when the kids got married and have moved out. They've started their own lives. And there's a bit of a pause where you step back to, in my opinion, a little bit more of a mentor role. But now there's grandchildren. So now it's, okay, we're re-engaging, and we're re-engaging differently to provide some of that love and that leadership and guidance that those little ones are going to need. And occasionally to whisper into the ears of our children about, some of the challenges that they're going to go through.
Absolutely. The analogy, it's just a funny analogy I think of sometimes, maybe Jurassic Park. With the Jeff Goldblum character, they're talking about dinosaurs escaping from the park. And he just says, life finds a way. And, life is a really powerful thing, and life does find a way. Our children are these extraordinary beings, and they meet people who are compatible with them, and life happens. These things happen. I had one question for you, because you said something, another thing which resonated with me, which is this idea of like, well, there was a gap, right? And then now we're back in it, different from before. Did you find, like when you first became a grandfather, that the games that you used to play, the things you used to do with your kids, like these things just came back to you like rote memory to do those things again with the next generation?
They did. And it was interesting because I think, as my oldest grandson is 3 years old, so at this point, I'm able to understand what that age is, where maybe the first time through, I was trying to do some activities or games that may have been more appropriate for a 5-year-old, just because I didn't know what a 3-year-old was capable of until I went through it. And so now definitely being able to pull those memories back out and going, oh, this is what a 3-year-old likes to do. This is what a 3-year-old needs to do. Certainly with the grandson, with a little bit of the rough and tumble play that they absolutely take to, and loving the idea of playing tag and running around the couch or running around in the front yard or doing some of those activities. Definitely came back. And that's one reason too. I also talk to people about getting back into physical shape or keeping yourself physically to a point where you can re-engage in that again. Meaning sometimes in our 20s and 30s, when those kids are generally coming along, we're still in fairly good shape where we don't have to work at it as much. But now that we are in our late 40s, 50s, and 60s, if you want to get down and run around and play horsey and do these things, you need to be taking a walk every once in a while. You need to be going to the gym and doing some yoga. You need to be doing, watching the diet a little bit. And the grandkids are a great little impetus for that.
They're a terrific impetus to get in better shape for, the activities we want to have now, but also I think just for the longer term. I actually just in the past 6 months, during the pandemic, I hired a personal trainer, and just worked with her over Zoom. And every day, part of the process is you have to fill out a diary. You go to a website, you fill out, uh, your exercises for the day, what you ate that day, but also at the top of the page is why are you doing this? And for me, my number one why was because I want to hike mountains with my great grandchildren, and so that's a pretty ambitious goal. And a good friend of mine who's a Greek American engineer, I told him this. I said, I'm going to hike. I'm really determined. I got grandkids now. I want to be able to hike mountains, not just with my grandkids, but with my great grandkids. And he looked at me and he said, "What mountains are you climbing now?" And I wasn't. I wasn't climbing any mountains now. So it was just this very direct challenge that if we're going to be there for them and really live this active life and have a shot at hiking with the great grandchildren, then we have to be as active as possible now. And the term one of the terms I have in my head is people talk about babysitting, and it's like, for us, it's baby running now because, they grow up and I'm chasing them around the playground and playing, and they're fast. So you're right. This is not a sit on the sidelines sport.
No, I feel when you're talking about the running around and doing those activities, in my mind, and this dates us, right, is I'm picturing the first Rocky movie where he's in the little courtyard chasing the chicken around. And I now have this training thing in my head, like, I need to go grab a chicken and go chase it. I'm going to have to, and get a trainer up there in the window telling me that, I got to be as fast as greased lightning. And because it's true, the kids get away from you pretty quick.
Well, we need to have a video of you running up the steps of City Hall in Philadelphia, holding your grandkids with the Rocky theme.
I might do it with the granddaughter because I'm going to trade off some weight on that one. She's about 7 months old versus a 3-year-old that's pretty solid at this point.
That's right. We don't want to be too much of a workout. It's just enough.
I gotta work up to the 3-year-old.
That's right, especially because they're going to get bigger, and so that's our training regimen. Is the Rocky step run with different size weights.
No, that would be something to get a bunch of grandpas up there running the steps with the grandkids. That would be something to see.
I wonder if Sylvester Stallone has grandkids.
I think I looked it up, and well, let's put it this way: I'm about 90% sure because he certainly has kids old enough.
Right. That's a whole other world. Is like the celebrity grandparent world, and one guy that came to mind is Keith Richards from the Stones. He's got something like 4 or 5 grandkids. He was asked about it in an interview, and he just said, if you live long enough, shit happens. That's the Keith Richards view of grandfatherhood. But
right.
That whole generation, I think Paul McCartney has a ton of grandkids. And
I think Rod Stewart's a great grandfather.
Is he?
I think so.
I can believe it. Yeah. Well, that's a whole show into itself, I think.
Yeah. That would be interesting to get a few of those guys on to talk about their experience, because that's got to be a different world as well when you're dealing with that level of popularity and schedules and completely different type of interactions and what you can and can't do.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a part of it, and also, I suspect, there's an awful lot of actors and musicians and other celebrities who have their public face, and then there's their family, which is obviously an intensely private thing. But when you're grandfather, it's the great equalizer, I think. Like where it doesn't matter if someone necessarily was a founder of the Beatles or it's you and I, because I think we have a shared experience. And I think those are the things I think that's worth all of us talking about. It's like, what are those experiences that help us live a better life and do the right thing for our kids and theirs.
Oh, absolutely. Because our attention goes all in on the grandkids when we have them. I don't know if you've had this experience, but when you're playing with them, when you're seeing their activities, their sporting events and things, are you as locked in on just that moment as what I think a lot of people tend to be as grandfathers, versus if you can think back to when your daughter and your kids were in those activities, how much of that time was then divided between the meetings that are coming up, the phone call that you need to take? Have you noticed a difference in that attention level or being in the moment, as they say?
I have. And, I think it's something that my wife and I work on a lot in terms of, that being in the moment, with our children and the grandkids and, putting the phone down. Modern smartphones, iPhones, whatever, are just engines of distraction. And they take us away from the moment. They take us away from really genuinely being with someone. And I think you're right, particularly when I'm with my grandkids, I'm just keenly aware of how precious every minute is. And I don't want to miss it. And I don't want them to miss that time with me, and to have, as many really focused shared experiences as we can. I mean, my favorite, there's all kinds of apps on my phone, but my favorite feature is airplane mode. I set it to airplane mode. It's fantastic. Plus the silence unknown callers, which is a fantastic feature on the iPhone, so I don't get spam calls. But I really don't like the distraction of just general, the tweets and then the Facebook posts and then this and this and this. And I get that social media is part of our lives right now, but I want to keep the focus on the social and not the media. So how do we really be there for them and to teach them, like I remember when my kids were in high school, like all the kids were getting iPhones, and we get so much blowback from our kids. So why can't I have a phone? And I said, well, the reason is that every time that I'm in a social gathering with those other kids, they're looking at their phones. And you know what? When you're in a social gathering, you have learned that you can have conversations with adults. And just because you're 16 years old doesn't mean that you should be staring at a phone and not engaging with an adult. So no, you can't have a phone. It didn't endear me to them for, quite some time, but I think in hindsight, they thank me for it because they learned some really, really important life skills. And I think of that, as a grandfather, like the lessons we teach our kids and how they echo to the next generation, and like what can we do to teach those things without being intrusive or stepping on our kids' toes and how they teach their own kids. And that's a tough line to find that right balance.
It is, because I think one of the greatest things that grandfathers and grandparents in general can do is let the parents parent, know that they're going to make some missteps and that they're not going to parent the way that we would parent, especially now that we've gone through it a cycle, but supporting them. And that's where I was saying earlier, sometimes it's just whispering about something and then just letting it go and leaving it alone and letting our kids take what we said and think about it. And if they implement it, great. If they don't, then that's their choice.
It's true. That's true. It's sort of educating with a light touch, I think.
Right. Because I don't think we would have reacted we wouldn't have reacted well, or at least certainly I wouldn't, had mother and mother-in-laws and fathers and father-in-laws jumped in when we were trying to teach lessons or we were trying to handle situations with the kids. And then we had very strong voices coming in from outside that was somewhat adding noise, even if it was well-meaning. I'm not sure I would have accepted it in the spirit that it was given, versus that just, at a quiet time, an appropriate time, just a whisper of, hey, have you thought about this? And then leaving it alone for me to contemplate.
Right. And I have a question for you kind of related to that, which is, do you find that your grandkids behave a lot better when they're with you versus their parents?
Yes. And I've had that come up on numerous conversations, both with adult grandchildren, people that are now in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and then also with grandparents, where grandchildren may be throwing a fit. They don't want to go to bed. They don't want the diapers changed. They don't want whatever's going on. But then if they're at the grandparents' house, they comply much easier and they go along with things much better. And when I've talked to adult grandchildren, there's this sense that even as little kids, they didn't want to let grandpa down. They didn't want to let grandma down. And that may be a part of they don't necessarily live with that person every day. And then it may also be that relationship is just different. That, because we've gone through a parenting cycle, that we know maybe when to push and when to back off when kids are going through a tantrum or almost going into a tantrum phase. And I'm talking about little kids at this point, but certainly that's been an answer to many questions that I've asked, that grandkids tend to behave better for grandparents.
So you mentioned that we've been through the cycle, and I think that's a really valid perspective that speaks to the experience. And I wonder if part of that sort of having been through it, and having experienced multiple tantrums and situations, that it took a lifetime, really. It took 10, 15 years of raising our kids to learn some lessons of how to guide behavior and how to put up with some behavior and not others. Right. And I'm remembering now when one of my grandsons was probably 2, was kind of in the terrible 2s, and we had played down at a playground. That was time to walk back to the house. And I think my back was sore or something. And I just, I wasn't going to carry grandson back. And it wasn't a huge distance. And he was perfectly capable of walking with me. But he sat down on the ground and he announced, and he just started bawling. It's like, I'm not going. You have to carry me. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't. You have to walk with me. And then, the challenge came again. The crying, the fits, the tantrum. It's like, you have to carry me. I walked 10 feet farther away. And I looked at him and I said, no, I'm serious. You have to walk with me. The bawling came back. He started crying and tanting. No, Grandma, you got to carry me. It's like, no, I'm sorry, I can't. My back hurts. It's not very far. You'll be fine. You're going to have to walk with me. He started crying again, throwing the tantrum. I walked another 10 feet away. And then I remember looking at the look in his face, and I just said to him, come on, let's go. And he got up, stopped crying, and he walked to me, and we walked home. And we were perfectly fine. He learned that it was okay to give up. And I reinforced that, you know what? If I say it's time to do something, this is what we're going to do. And that was 15 years maybe before I actually learned that, sometimes, where I really learned it with my own kids. Like, they need to have those boundaries. And I mean, do you think it's, the kids are, you use the words, well, we didn't want to let Grandpa down. And how much of that is, we don't want to cross Grandpa or Grandma. We don't want to make them unhappy. And we don't want to break the rules that they've set down.
I think that's definitely included in that phrase about not letting Grandpa down. I would guess that when I'm talking to these people that are now our age, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, that the idea of crossing Grandpa or Grandma, they're not thinking back necessarily to that younger 3-4 years old age, but they're thinking back to those teenage years. And so it's a different perspective, but I definitely think that the not crossing Grandpa or Grandma falls into that same bucket, if you will. And the other thing or question I've got for you is, if that had happened, that scenario had happened with your kids, and think back to, I don't know if you were 30, 35 at that point, and we went to the park, we had a good time, you're much younger, and they throw that same fit, would you have reacted the same way, or do you think you would have risen to, let's say, a perceived challenge to yourself?
Oh, I think when I was in my 30s, I was much more volatile, much more emotional. And, I think I and a lot of parents, we're just, a lot of times we're firecrackers. They're ready for someone to light our fuse. Lots of work pressure and time dealing with, daycare, and a lot of juggling going on, a lot of pressure, the anxiety of, am I doing this right? And sort of trying to navigate the waters of being a parent, and then being challenged. And there is, sometimes kids just like to push our buttons. Mm-hmm. And I can see them playing their parents like a piano, because I was there. Like, I had my buttons pushed plenty. And I think part of my approach now, and, being now, I'll be 62 in July, I am, I'm a calmer person. I am a more even-keeled person, perhaps, older and wiser in some ways. And my buttons are not so easily pushed. And I think I've learned where the lines are. And the kids need to know the lines. My wife is masterful at this. Like when she's doing something with one of our grandkids, and she happens to be a championship cookie maker, among many other things. But, whatever the particular thing is, a granddaughter will, say, I want a drink, and she'll just look at us, well, how do you ask for a drink? Not angry, but how do you ask for that? So, can I please have a drink? Says, absolutely. I'm happy to get you a drink. So it's not, no one's pushing the buttons, but it's clear what the rules are. And the rules are conveyed in a way that's just very matter of fact and loving, caring, I think, nurturing. So, and I think kids pick up on that. They want that. They really want that, because they don't always know where the lines are. And if they see us getting upset, or when they saw me getting angry as a 35-year-old trying to get the result I wanted, that just fanned their own flames. So I think my sense is, and I'm far from being a psychologist here, but that there is an element that we learn over time, that even-keeled nature that these kids gravitate towards, and it's one of the things that they love about being with us.
I think you're absolutely right, and I love the way that you express that. Is we can still keep those boundaries, we can still teach what's acceptable and not acceptable without getting as emotional about it as we used to. That's part of the reason I think you see grandkids behaving, let's say, better at grandma and grandpa's house than maybe sometimes at their own house, because there's not that volatility. And I think kids, to your point, they push buttons. They're because they're probing. They're looking for where those boundaries are. Where are those fringes? And so they're going to go there. And when it's met with that kind of volatility of a reaction, one, they can do it just because if they're upset, they can make you upset, and they know how to do that. Versus if grandma and grandpa don't get upset and you just calmly turn around and are asking, what's the right way to ask for a drink of water? They're going to give it to you.
And I found, I'm curious what your experience in this. It's been a while since I was on an airplane, but like all of us, I suppose. But kids crying on crowded planes. I see young people who look like they're going through water torture listening to it, and I see parents, trying to juggle a screaming toddler in their lap. And I just smile. I said, it's okay. It's okay. This is music to me.
Yeah. And, it was interesting and it's funny you bring that up, because my dad traveled all the time, and he was one of these guys where he would get into a situation and everybody becomes best friends, and which was great. But his experience, oftentimes when I'd pick him up from the airport or we'd be talking about his travel, he'd be a young mother that had screaming kids, maybe 2 or 3 of them, whatever's going on, or a young family. You got to remember, this is back in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, different times. He would take one of those kids, just play with them on the plane and get them to calm down and get them to, and very much the same thing where instead of being the uptight businessman who's really upset about the noise, he just went into his own little grandpa mode and was like, oh, let me, help you out. I can tell that the young one, the 2-year-old or the younger one, is very tired because we learn those different cries, right? We learn between I'm not happy cry to I'm tired cry to this is a hungry cry. And, picking those things up, that we kind of play with that a little bit. And I do some of that myself when I'm doing traveling. If I see young mom with kids and one of them's just getting really fussy and they're in the next seat or next row or something like that, if I've got some little gadgets in my bag, I'll do some of that myself, even a little flashlight that I might have or something along those lines. We just jump in and start, helping out the way we can versus expecting, that struggling young parent to suddenly magically make a kid stop crying at 37,000 feet.
That's interesting that you say that. Is there like a switch in our heads that we gain over time, right? Like you just went right into, how can I help? Right? Is that switch more active in a grandparent who's been through this cycle a few times and we're just more ready to help, or is that just happenstance?
It may be personal, meaning just somebody's makeup, personality wise or whatnot, but I think too there's a little bit of wanting to jump in and help this parent out because at some point I was a young parent with little kids on an airplane or a bus or, in the subway, whatever it is. And they're missing their nap time. They're hungry. They're whatever. And there's a little bit of thinking back that some people showed me some grace at different points and helped out and were tolerant. So there's a little bit of paying back karma. I don't know if you can pay back karma, but anyway, kind of putting back into the putting back into the system a little bit from people helping you out. But I do think as a grandparent, and I see it a lot with grandmothers that will do that and jump in. The odd thing is, though, the way society is and the way things are now, I'm sometimes a little bit more cautious than I feel like I would normally be, only from the standpoint of who's the strange guy who's now taking an interest in my kid, or who's, and it's all circumstance and it's all based on the moment. And most of the time everybody lets you help or would judge the situation. But again, in the back of our minds, I think there's a little bit of like not wanting to get involved, which is sad to me because there's a bunch of grandfathers and grandmothers walking around that would love to do nothing but help a young struggling mom or dad out in a situation like that.
It's true. I tell you a quick story that come back to, what I've been doing in my career, but I got involved in making, the viral video craze at one point, web content. So we did a show starring Florence Henderson on the web. And we actually had, we did a whole knockoff parody of the Brady Bunch. We had the actual set from the Brady Bunch that were taken out of storage from Paramount Pictures. And we got to work with Florence Henderson on the set of the Brady Bunch. And I just talked with her in between takes. I wrote the script and we produced this thing. I'm talking to Florence Henderson. And she had her own sort of blog, right? And you could ask Flo a question. And she got tremendous satisfaction out of this, that she was over 80 at the time. She was only lived like maybe 4 years after we worked with her. And she said, you would be shocked at how many emails I get from young people who are looking for guidance in their life. And a lot of these young people they're from dysfunctional families. She said there was a high proportion of minority youngsters who were reaching out to her, who were in broken families and difficult situations, and they just wanted some guidance. And they saw her as this motherly, grandmotherly figure. So they were sort of looking at her as she was the quintessential mom, right? She was like the mom, from the 70s and the groovy, but she had the gray hair. And so she was this guru of advice for people. And it just drove home to me, like, how many people would love to have, the mom or the grandma, the grandpa, and like someone who's been through some shit to tell them what to do, and not say, go do this, but have you thought about this way? Here's another way to deal with what you're going through in your life. And so I never take for granted, after I talked with her, I never took for granted that I had two parents who helped me every minute of their lives. I had a grandfather, and I got to know him. And I don't take for granted that I have this chance to be there for my grandkids and to be some force and guide in their life, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people really have this vacuum in their lives of that older person that they can go to and get some mentoring and some nurturing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is why we've started our different projects too, to an extent. And talking about that, I do want to dive into how you got started with your blog and the website, The Good Grandpa, because it dovetails nicely into what we were just talking about, where it's a different set of group that's looking for some guidance, because that was how the Cool Grandpa kind of came about as well, as similar circumstances. But why don't you talk to us about how Good Grandpa came about?
I will tell you the Good Grandpa origin story, but first I have to give a shout out to you and Cool Grandpa, because when I saw your site and I saw what you're doing with the podcast, I thought, this is fantastic. So thank you for doing all of what you're doing. So it's definitely kind of, sparked my thinking of other things that I could do. It was just really nice to see, yourself as a grandfather doing what you're doing. So I applaud you for doing that.
Thank you.
In my own case, I mentioned that moment when I found out I was going to be a grandfather, how overwhelming that was. And I had, at the time, I spent a good half of my career, the latter half of my career, working on the internet, working on the web, creating web content to engage people and entertain, and doing this for branding purposes, started a company to do that. And so of course I went to the web and, just trying to figure out, how do I, what is a grandfather? How do I do this? I couldn't ask the one grandfather I had, because he passed away in the early 1980s. There's no one to ask, really. I mean, it was my father I could talk to, but he had actually passed away by then actually as well. So I went in the web, and of course the movie that was out was Bad Grandpa.
Yep.
And, this lascivious, drunk, deranged character. And, I get comedy. I've worked with comics, and it's all, it wasn't like, I'm not against comedy. I'm pro comedy. I've got a sense of humor about things, but there really wasn't anything positive about being a grandfather. It was all this stupid stereotype. So, did a trademark search. Good Grandpa's available. The website was available, and registered the URL. I said, great, I'm doing it now. And within a month of seeing that sonogram, goodgrandpa.com was live, and I just started writing about my experiences. And my original intent for it was to kind of be a guide for others and provide, insights on, what you could do. And very quickly, I came to the conclusion that I'm not an expert on grandparenting. I'm a newbie. I have a lot to learn. And the way that I could perhaps sort of help others was not by sort of saying, look, here are the 5 tips for good, being a good grandpa or whatever, but to write stories, to write true stories about my experiences. And that is what worked for me. And I found it started to resonate with other people because they relate to some of the stories. And I think throughout time, whenever people have gathered, whether it's around a campfire, with a modern campfire, which is often the internet these days, of people gathering and talking and sharing their lives, that stories are great providers of wisdom, but in a way that's captivating and interesting and not preachy. I don't have anything to, I'm not implying in any way that I'm a better grandpa than anybody else. That's not my judgment to make. All I can do is to try to honestly share my experience and make my writing as truthful to my experiences as possible. And it's funny, and we've probably had, a similar experience with, the Cool Grandpa. When you start a blog or website or whatever, it's kind of like you're talking in a room by yourself. That's what it feels like. But just gradually over time, and I've really found it's accelerating now because there's more people our age who are becoming grandpas and grandmas, and there are a lot more people who are still very active in their careers, who are using the web for work purposes, and that people are just reaching out and say, I was really moved by that story. It reminded me of this that happened, with my mother, or this. And that there is an element of learning that people pick up on without my, trying to pretend that I'm something I'm not, as in terms of being an expert. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And shared a very similar thing in terms of when I started this thing out too, is, I'm noticing media like Christmas Vacation, or I'm dating myself again, right? 16 Candles or anything else where that typically grandpa shows up, he gets drunk, falls asleep on the couch, or bad grandpa, makes a bunch of inappropriate jokes or whatever. But then I think both of us are thinking back to, wait a second, grandpas play a huge positive role, or they can, into the family and the grandchildren. And nobody's really talking about that. So I'm going to take my little corner of the internet and wave my flag and say, wait a second, grandpas do good work. We're doing that through similar telling of stories. I'm capturing stories from other people. And it's certainly not, this is the only way to do it, but it's ways of, hey, this is what my grandfather did, or this is what I'm doing now. And so I think that resonates quite well, because there isn't a one size fits all, but there's some shared experiences, and there's things that come out where like, oh, right, this is what my grandfather did, and it had a huge impact. So now we want to draw that consciousness out of people to say, hey, remember when your grandfather took you on that 3-day cross-country trip, and how important that was, and how it made you feel really like you were the center of grandpa's universe. And hey, maybe you should plan a trip like that with your grandchild. That's what we get from your blogs and from your writings. And hopefully that's what people get from our conversation here this evening.
That's exactly right. And, you brought up, those kind of shared experiences, and something that's very much on my mind, and it matches what the purpose of what goodgrandpa.com is, which is to nurture the next great generation. And my thinking on it was that, Tom Brokaw and others, they talked about the greatest generations being our parents' generation. And, you mentioned your parents sort of, living through World War II and probably the Great Depression. And my thinking was they were absolutely great. They were absolutely the most fantastic people. And I take nothing away from their greatness. But when I look at these, the 2-year-olds and the 3-year-olds, and I look at what we have, which our parents never had a chance to do this, right? They didn't have the internet. They didn't have the ability to start a blog or a magazine, start telling these stories, start sort of disseminate wisdom and, and create community. And how do we harness this in a way that the really great generation, like the greatest generation ever, is the one that's in diapers right now? It's the one, they're in play school, they've got Cheerios on their tray. And how do we build up experiences and channel the things and learn from the things that are wrong with our society and teach them a different way? Like, and one thing that just really strikes me is we're in this period of like such intense disagreement as a country, right? Red states and blue states. And I just don't buy it. I just don't buy it. Because the number one thing we all have in common is our kids and our grandkids. Yeah. And if we just start the conversation there, right? And we work with our kids and our grandkids and we say, you know what? Instead of writing angry Facebook posts about the other side, on whatever side that is, I'm going to teach the idea to the best ability that I can. I'm going to teach the phrase, I respectfully disagree. And it's like, if we can just do that, right? And that's like one of a million things. Like, if we can instill that idea with people, that we can be civil with each other, and we can be on completely different planets in terms of our belief systems and our values, but we can just say, I respectfully disagree. It's like, I want kids saying that in grade school. You know what I mean? And that's how we're going to change our country. Not by, clawing at each other's entrails on Facebook and CNN and all these other talk shows. It's like, let's start with what we agree on.
Right. I mean, if occasionally you can get a Red Sox fan and a Yankees fan to sit together in a bar and have a beer together and just talk baseball, then, there's certainly room for people that disagree on other topics to sit down and say, I hear you. I don't agree with that, but here we are, and we're looking to do the best we can for our families and grandkids.
Well, as long as we agree that the Red Sox are a much better team, I think we're on solid ground in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm not picking a side on that one. Although I will tell you, I guess I can, as a Dodger fan, I'm okay with hating the Yankees. And even my best friends who are Yankees fans, we will get along and we will talk baseball. And occasionally we do go, man, those guys in Boston or those guys in Oakland or those, whatever team's having a great time and a great player, we recognize that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sportsmanship first.
Yes. Yeah.
In Boston, they say that, with the Bruins, that I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out.
Yep. And that's, and to your point, there's so much more to life than whether it's politics or sports or whatever it is, that phrase, I respectfully disagree, is so important, so that you can then move on to talking about, well, how's your family doing? What can we do to help? And hey, how do we help our communities? And how do we build up strong families and strong kids that can then become that great generation?
Exactly. And maybe the greatest generation,
Absolutely. I mean, with the amount of technology that's being thrown at them, at the pace that it's being thrown at them, being able just to juggle it, manage it, figure out how to use it properly, it is going to be a huge challenge. I think when people look back hundreds of years from now, this period of time is going to be looked at as one of such great, I don't know if upheaval is the right word, but definitely change in lifestyles and in communication and in so many things, because of the technology that is coming so much more rapidly than I think has ever happened before.
It seems to be just a fascinating combination of that rapid change you're talking about with an element of an archival element, if you will. It's like the stories that my grandfather told me. We have some of them on a reel-to-reel tape, in a basement, and I don't even know where I can find a reel-to-reel machine to play them on. But the things that we write and record now on websites, at least it has a greater shot of being something that's around or easily accessible when my grandkids who are 2 are 20 or 40. And that's a key difference between the generations that I think we can leverage with these digital platforms for grandparents.
Absolutely, because our voices and our images are going to be there where before we only had still pictures or maybe silent movies that maybe they hadn't deteriorated all the way. Where my great grandkids could look back and hear one of these podcasts and at least hear what my voice sounded like.
Yes, absolutely.
So Ted, we've had you on quite a long time. Anything that we haven't covered that you would like to bring up?
I would just encourage a couple things. What I would love to see is that we have a broader conversation in our society and around the world with what grandparents can do, the role that we can play, and the responsibility we have to nurture that next great generation, and also to address the stigma. There is a stigma to being older. We live in a very youth-oriented culture. At my own company, I was told by an employee when I announced that I was, within a few months of announcing that I was going to be a grandfather, I saw in a corporate memo from my own company that I was on a faster track to retirement than the other partners. My own company. So my own company, I experienced age discrimination because I used the word grandfather in relation to my life. And I think that's wrong. And we need young people to understand that being a grandfather is not a recipe for decrepitude, disability. Those things happen, they're real. But we grandparents need to be recognized as a source of wisdom and guidance. And, aging can be difficult, but it brings a lot of gifts that we can share with people. So I would hope that the work that we do will help find a voice for people, not just the United States, but in other countries to, step up and play the role that we're uniquely qualified to do because we've been through these cycles of raising kids that you've talked about. And let's have a discussion. I'm happy to always have discussions. People can reach me at goodgrandpa.com and let's talk. Because when we talk things through, we find, I think, new solutions to helping the world and doing the right thing for these kids. So that's my overarching goal. And more conversations I can have like this and sort of broaden that community, then that's a good day.
Absolutely. And it strengthens the family and it strengthens the community. One thing too that people don't realize or think about is that not everybody's blessed to make it to becoming a grandfather or a grandmother. There's no guarantees about tomorrow for any of us. And those of us that make it and are a grandparent, we're lucky and we're blessed to be able to share a little bit of life's wisdom and our experiences and, spoil those kids with an ice cream cone slipped on the side that, mom doesn't need to know about.
Ice cream is an important food group. We can't ignore the ice cream and the jelly beans here.
Absolutely not. It helps the kids get taller.
That's right.
Now, folks, again, that's thegoodgrandpa.com. I'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes. I'm going to ask you one more time, any advice for a new grandfather that you might have? We've talked awful lot about it, but is there any other words of wisdom that you would have for somebody listening to this that's a new grandfather? So
I would relay the advice that my great aunt Lois told me, which I actually wrote about in a story on goodgrandpa.com. It's called Reunion. It's about us all getting together, after getting our vaccine, after all this separation from the pandemic. And my aunt Lois, who's, my late mom's sister, Aunt Lois is still with us. She's 95 years old. She's got lots of grandkids and great grandkids. And I asked her when I was going to be grandfather, I said, how do I be a better grandparent? And the one thing she said, And the only thing she said was, be there for them. That's it. Be there for them. And it wasn't a 1 hour speech. It wasn't a long lesson, but a tremendous amount of wisdom was packed into those very few words. And I really do think after 7 years of this, which by the way, still makes me a newbie, but I would say that's the number one thing. Just be there for that. Whatever we can do, whatever we can do. And to your point, be there in the moment, be focused. All those moments are incredibly precious. They're precious to them and they're super meaningful to us. But if we're there for them, then that is the beginning and the end, in my opinion.
That's powerful stuff and good stuff. I mean, just focus on those kids, focus on what they need, focus when they're telling you stuff. Because I've had stories where people go, hey, I went to my grandfather when I was in my teens to tell him important life choices that teenagers go through. But I wouldn't have gone there if he hadn't been paying attention to me years before. So being there for them when they're 3, when they're 5, when they're 10 pays off, because then they will come back to you with important life decisions and life conversations when they're teenagers. And you won't get that if you haven't been there for them early on.
Absolutely. And just turn off the phones. Just use that airplane mode, because, this is our shot to have experiences with them that they remember forever. And that takes a lot of focus. It takes a lot of dedication.
So, Ted, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. This has been a real treat, and I love hearing your story and hearing what Good Grandpa is doing and how we're very similar in how we got started with our projects. That's awesome that we're starting to find our community out there in this space. And, the more of us that are waving those flags saying, hey, this role is important and this role is meaningful, just can't do anything else but help strengthen our communities and our families. So thank you so much for being on here.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and for hearing me out and reading the stories. It means a lot to me to know that someone's reading my stuff and wants to help me share it. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
What a great conversation with Ted. I'm so excited to learn from these awesome grandfathers that we have on the Cool Grandpa podcast. What I really enjoyed in our conversation and the big takeaway that I had was this idea of being able to teach grandchildren that it's okay to respectfully disagree with other people. It's so important right now, especially that we seem so polarized and so tribal in our thinking, whether, as we use the analogy, Red Sox versus, Yankee fans, or Yankee fans versus Dodger fans, or whatever that is that we use, that, it's important to be able to say, hey, at the core of each individual, if you have the same core beliefs, and that could be that we want the best for our families, we want the best for our grandchildren, we want the best for our communities, that we can differ on philosophies and we can differ on how we approach reaching those goals of having the best for those individuals and entities that I talked about. So how are you guys going through, and how are you guys in your relationships being able to tell young and old grandchildren and your friends that, hey, we can respectfully disagree, but we can still communicate and we can still be friends and we can still get along and we can still serve each other? So please go to my website, www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the show notes, click on the link, leave me some comments about what your big takeaway was from this conversation. So until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.